We're happy to start out this morning with a report on a particular project of the Center for Interfaith Engagement, and then end the morning with a few comments from the Center directors about projections for this coming year, or this year. I'm going to introduce the Associate Director of the Center for Interfaith Engagement, Trina Nussbaum, who will introduce the program that we're going to see here in relation to the study. And in the question and answer period, we'll have all of the personnel participate, and then we'll finish with some reports from the leadership of the center. So, Trina.
Good morning. I'm Trina Nussbaum, Associate Director for the Center for Interfaith Engagement, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you, Vernon, as always, for advocating for us. He's been a wonderful advocate ever since the beginning. I want to introduce just very briefly why we're here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay and let her take the rest of this part. So we were invited. Well, actually, let me start for even that. In 2017, the Seeking Peace in Israel and Palestine, a resolution for Mennonite Church USA, was passed at the Mennonite Convention in Orlando in 2017. And one of the requests or mandates in that resolution was that a task force of sorts would be created to discuss, expose, look at, research all of the different verbs you can think of, Mennonite and Jewish relationships in the U.S. Lack of or presence of working on all the different aspects of relationships between Mennonites in the U.S. and Jewish communities in the U.S. and abroad, but particularly in the U.S. And so the Mennonite Jewish Relationships Task Force got its start. And there are multiple academics, scholars, practitioners, pastors. Lisa Sherkozy in the back was also on that. Tim and I, multiple people from across the country, pastors of First Mennonite Church in San Francisco, all the way to scholars who are Mennonite but are scholars in Judaism as well. And we were kind of asked within that task force to look at a mapping kind of research or mapping project. Wanted to know where the existing relationships are in the U.S. between Mennonites and Jewish communities. And so we asked Lindsay Acker, who is currently an undergraduate peacebuilding student at AU, to undertake this for us. And she readily agreed, and I think has done a great job. So before I take up any more time, I want to ask Lindsay to come up and tell a little bit about herself and how she ended up here, more than what I'm going to say. And thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Trina. Good morning. So this is just really quick what we're going to do today. Thank you, Trina, for that introduction and Vernon. We're going to talk a little bit about the research, kind of why it happened. We heard a little bit about that, but we heard a little refresher in a second. How it happened, and then major findings and takeaways from that. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the Center for Interfaith Engagement and celebrate its 10-year anniversary a little bit. So as Trina said, this came out of the Seeking Peace in Israel and Palestine, a resolution for Mennonite Church USA, and out of that came a working group that asked the Center for Interfaith Engagement to do this research. And the goal was kind of to have a starting point. What are Mennonite Jewish relations in the U.S. right now? What do they look like? How did they start? What are barriers? What are hopes for the future? Where can we take this? And then why me? Mostly because I cared and I was available. I grew up cultural exchange growing up. It's a really fancy term for saying that I grew up connected to the Jewish community in Buffalo, New York. And my best friend growing up, she came over and decorated a Christmas tree. and made Easter eggs with me, and I went over and celebrated Passover and Hanukkah and some other things. So I grew up thinking that was the norm, and then I came to EMU and found out very quickly that that was not the norm. And then I also have a lot of family connections to Israel, family that worked there through MCC or Mennonite Mission Network. And so I've always been thinking about that conflict specifically. And then in fall 2017, I went on cross-cultural, my EMU cross-cultural with Lisa Shirk and Bill Goldberg, focused specifically on the conflict and peace-building efforts and what is happening there and what we can do about it. And I came back feeling like I had a responsibility to continue that somehow. And this worked. Trina met me at a coffee shop and said, we're doing this project. And I said, oh, this might be a way for me to continue, and I had the time. So we started with mapping Mennonite Jewish relations, which is big. It's a lot. We couldn't possibly do everything. I had a semester of time. So we tried to define a scope, tried to look at, okay, what specific Mennonite Jewish relations are we looking at, where, how, all of that. And then we found out that I couldn't be work study eligible for this work, which meant that I, due to being an EMU student, needed a different job. And my time went from 10 hours of paid work, which is what I thought I would have, to 3 hours of volunteer work, which makes it really hard to do such a big project. So we defined the scope, again, way down, and settled on sending out a survey to MCUSA pastors, specifically about their church's connections to local synagogues and the local Jewish community near them. So that is what we looked at exclusively. There are obviously way more aspects to Mennonite Jewish relations in the United States, and you can definitely see a lot more research on that. But this is specifically what we were doing. So we sent out a survey, we recorded and consolidated the data. These are the survey questions we had. We were looking at connections, just what is your connection? Do you have one? What does it look like? What does it mean for you? We looked at how it's changed over time, if it has. Has it impacted congregational life? Is this something that exists and kind of over on the side, or does it come through in different ways in worship? What barriers, if any, have arisen? Do you have a vision for the future? And then who else should I be talking to?
Joe was wondering about the front lights, but we want to see her too.
Didn't unfortunately have time to really go into that. Most of the answers were either other pastors of other churches that I'd already heard from, or they were different rabbis or Jewish leaders that we really wanted to take the time to reach out to, but at the end of the day,
I'll let you do it.
That's definitely an area for further contact and communication and relationship and research. So major findings and takeaways. There were 79 responses from 76 different pastors, who responded twice, and 71 different churches, again, multiple pastors sometimes responded from the same church. 25 responders have no relationship, which I did the math this morning, should mean that 46 churches did. Someone can test me on that. There were 7 main different types of relationships, 3 apparent effects that came out as pastors were talking and answering the other questions, 4 notable barriers, and 3 main areas for growth that we identified. Types of relationships, the big 7 that came out were pastoral friendships and professional relationships. This was, I met a rabbi at this conference, or I'm friends with the local rabbi here, and sometimes they come and do sermon, or we talk together a lot about, different aspects of faith and our faiths, and learn from each other in that sense. The second main relationship was an activism-based connection. Community organizing, vigils, connection through other social justice organizations, like NAACP was mentioned a couple times. Interfaith organizations or clergy support groups. A lot of the activism-based connection was through interfaith organizations, but there are also a lot of interfaith organizations that you meet and you talk about different faiths and you learn from each other, or they're different clergy support groups. Then there were education-based connections. These were mostly Sunday school or college campuses or different classes that churches offer. Congregational connections, including meal sharing, joint worship, anything that got the body of the church also involved. Informal included intermarriage, interpersonal connections, people who attend both a synagogue and a church in the congregation. And then space sharing included churches that rented from synagogues or synagogues that rented space from churches, which led to some really interesting relationships. Those are really fun to read about. Some others that came up were campus ministries, direct service agencies, mission-oriented relationships, and then a few churches mentioned Jewish Voices for Peace specifically as kind of their whole relationship with Jewish community. The main effects that we saw coming out of these relationships for those churches that had strong relationships or long-term relationships or a lot of different types of relationships, we saw over time, they all mentioned an increase in the depth of that relationship. This is one quote that their relationship has grown gradually over time. There were a lot of quotes like that. It's deepened, it's grown, we're a lot closer, we trust each other more. Increased knowledge, these references now are personal references, so on this page, those are the number of churches that had those relationships. You'll notice they don't add up to 71 because multiple churches had different types of relationships. Now we'll move on to my personal references, so if you have any questions, I can point you directly to that quote. So our relationship has grown gradually over time. The second main effect was increased knowledge and awareness. So again, another quote we have begun to study more deeply the Jewish Jesus. This also included churches that felt like they understood their own traditions and relationships more because of learning from Jewish communities, learning Jewish history, learning about Jewish interpretations. And then we have increased activism. We've been able to build trust and as a result deepen our dialogue and mutual service projects. A lot of churches found that as they grew in connection, they learned more about different social justice movements that they could be a part of, or learned more about anti-Semitism in their own communities and really felt like they should be engaged in that. And so that included an increase in activism. The main barriers that came up, there were four, as I mentioned. Palestine and Israel came up a lot in many different ways. This quote, there's a limited ability to dialogue regarding Israel-Palestine conflict in a constructive way, kind of encapsulated most of those responses. A lot of people said, we tried to talk about it once and it didn't go well, so we don't anymore. Or we're afraid to talk about it because we've heard some things, or we think this and everybody around us thinks something else. Sometimes that even included other churches around us think something else, so we just don't really talk about it. Another main barrier was knowledge, or a lack thereof, on kind of both sides or all different aspects. So one quote, a lack of a working knowledge of the rich history of Judaism from which to be curious. A couple pastors mentioned that they felt like they didn't know enough to reach out in a way that wasn't insensitive. And then embedded anti-Semitism among Christians and Christian theology, legitimate suspicion of Christians in general because of evangelical attempts at converting Jews. This was another thing that came up a lot, that churches were trying to build trust and didn't really know how to do that and felt like there was a lot of pushback because they either didn't know enough about our own anti-Semitism in the Mennonite church or in the Christian church in general, or they felt like there was a lot of suspicion and they didn't know how to work their way through that. The last two main barriers, one was location. This was the most common reason that a church did not have a connection, was because these are not direct quotes, they're just exemplifying quotes. There was no Jewish community in this town, in this county, in the next 40 miles, in the next 60 miles. There's none that we know of. There's maybe a few Jewish neighbors, but no synagogue. And this was, definitely the reason for most, not all, of the we don't have a relationship responses. And this also, a lot of the pastoral responses responses had this as well. If they had only a pastoral connection and really no other connection, it was true because the synagogue was so far away that they related with the rabbi and he came to preach, or she came to preach sometimes, but we don't have a longer relationship than that because it's an hour drive or something like that. And the last one I called connection fatigue. There's probably a better term for that out there somewhere. But this also came up a few times. The greatest barrier to our connections with the synagogue is probably just the fact that the synagogue is small. And sometimes the burden of building relationships across differences is felt mainly by them. I think the last rabbi sometimes tired of all these interfaith requests. This was another common, especially in smaller towns where there was only one synagogue, or in some towns there was one synagogue that shared a rabbi with another synagogue 10, 15, 20 miles away. And a couple pastors mentioned that it was hard for the rabbi then to be engaged, or hard for the Jewish community to feel like on all of these interfaith activities, when everyone wanted a Jewish presence, a Jewish perspective, a Jewish voice, to have so many people asking something from them. Main areas of growth that we saw, first, the fact that 25 of 71 didn't have any connection. Again, a lot of those were for location, but not all of them were. I'm sure there's also a lot of churches, well, I know there's a lot of churches we didn't hear from. I sent out over 1,000 emails, we got 79 responses. So there's definitely room for growth there as well in our own research and reaching more people. And this was another quote, we don't have much need for a relationship. I saw that a few times. So again, just increasing the numbers of relationships, the numbers of churches engaged. Another area for growth is proactive action. A lot of the relationships we saw were, we had this relationship through an interfaith organization, and then insert anti-Semitic act in our community here, and then we reached out. And then we had a dinner, we had a meeting, we had a vigil, we invited the rabbi to speak, we had a joint service after something happened. Other than interfaith organizations, there were very few relationships or activities that stemmed from an interest other than we had this act and felt like we needed to respond. And definitely I'm not saying that it's bad to respond. I think it's important to respond, but there were few relationships that were built proactively before something like that. And then finally, congregational relationships. Impacts varied. So we saw those three main effects for churches that had a lot of relationships, or very deep relationships, or had relationships over a long period of time. There were also a lot of churches that had a rabbi come to speak every now and then, or had someone teach a Sunday school class for 25 people. And so a lot of pastors were unsure about what that congregational impact actually was. Very commonly, people said, well, we're a little bit more aware now. We know a little bit more than we used to. But there's also, a lack of real connection, not much impact. A couple pastors said something like this one quote, I think some fear that their Christian faith will be compromised if they learn of a different faith tradition or visit a mosque or synagogue. And that was also echoed a couple other times. Some pastors said, I think I'm the only one interested, really, or I feel like I'm the only one that's putting any effort into this relationship. So just to summarize that, we had 7 main relationships. We had 3 main effects: increased relationship, increased knowledge and awareness, and increased activism. We had 4 main barriers, those being conversations around Palestine and Israel, a lack of knowledge, location of churches and synagogues, and connection fatigue. And then we had 3 areas for growth, including numbers of connection, proactive action instead of only responsive action, and quality of congregational relationships. And that is the end of my brief introduction. Feel free to think of questions, write them down if you have them. I'll be back up in a bit. And I also have, plenty more to tell if you want to.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Do Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Good morning, my name is Tim Seidel, Service Director at the Center for Interfaith Engagement, also Assistant Professor of Peace Building and Development at EMU. And as the next step in our conversation this morning, I'm going to give just a brief overview of some of the things that are going on at CIE. Before I jump into that, I have a question for you. Maybe have a little bit of conversation here at your tables before I start talking some more. So one quick question for you. In your small group tables, maybe you can just take 30 seconds or a minute and talk about it. Here's my question. What does interfaith mean? So when you hear interfaith, what comes to mind for you? So could you take like just 1 minute and kind of get our minds flexed a little bit, get our conversation going, and then I'll call you back in, and then we'll keep going with our presentation. What is interfaith? What is it? Take a minute, please.
I'll buy that.
And then the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Seventh-day Adventists, they have 3 days out of the week and they go to bed. And for different areas of
All right, thank you, everybody. Let's regather here. Let's regather. And I'm just curious, maybe just 2 or 3 responses. What was a consensus that emerged at the table, or just any response that you heard to this question? What does interfaith mean? Anybody? Go ahead and shout it out.
Historically, territory means identify faiths, but it could be territory for people of faith or not faith.
Okay, so something about the territory and spaces between peoples of different faith and how they relate to each other.
I think historically, but
Historically.
But
Great, thank you. Anybody else? What was the piece that came out of your table conversation?
We have an interesting comment here about how music plays into interfaith things. Oh, sorry, we had an interesting comment about how music plays into this, but I should let John talk because he's the one that brought it up.
All right, so the role of music in how these spaces how these spaces emerge in relationships. Wonderful, thank you. Trini,
It often means ecumenical instead of interfaith. So oftentimes when associations or groups call themselves interfaith, it often means ecumenical instead of actually interfaith. Oftentimes groups or associations will call themselves interfaith. What they really mean is it's intra-faith or ecumenical.
okay. So there's a helpful distinction to make between intra-faith ecumenical relations and interfaith or cross-faith difference. Although sometimes the distances, intra-faith, interfaith, really vary a lot, don't they? Yeah. Great, well, thank you very much. Just wanted to kind of get you all talking a little bit before I started talking some more. Again, good morning. The Center for Interfaith Engagement is 10 years old. So this past year, over the 19-20 academic year, we've been celebrating and reflecting on this past decade of work. Among other things, this involves this year hosting guest lectures on campus at EMU. We have a campus project that has been funded by Interfaith Youth Corps to assess and get a sense of how students are experiencing, students of non-Christian backgrounds are experiencing their time at EMU. We have another spring film series lined up again. This semester, the theme will be looking at issues of sustainability, climate change, and interfaith relations. The steering committee of the Peace Camp is reconvening to examine and analyze and determine the next steps on Peace Camp, which has been a regular occurrence here in our community. Have you heard of Interfaith Peace Camp? Something we were really looking forward to this coming summer is the next series in this dialogue between Shia Muslim and Mennonite Christian folks, primarily between in Iran and the US and Canada. As you all can imagine, there's a lot of questions about moving ahead on that right now, if not in particular for the US participants in that dialogue. It is scheduled still to go on. The CIA has been a part of sponsoring that as well. Student engagement has been a significant piece of our focus over the last couple of years. In addition to supporting Lindsay in her research, we have another student practicum who will be working with us this semester that we're really excited about. And then finally, continuing the conversation on the research that Lindsay had mentioned. So these are some of the things that are going on for us right now. Again, looking back on the last 10 years of CIE's work, I know a number of you know a lot about reflecting and taking stock and looking ahead toward the next decade of the Center for Interfaith Engagement's work might look like. One thing I just want to highlight really quickly before we move into some Q&A to talk more about the research Lindsay shared. Like I said, one of the priorities CIE has identified over the last couple of years is enhancing student learning experience at EMU around interfaith. One of the ways that we did this past year was we were able to secure some funds to send a small group of folks to Interfaith Youth Corps' Interfaith Leadership Institutes in Chicago this past August. Here's a picture of some folks who participated. You'll see Pastor Brian Martin-Burkholder, the campus pastor at EMU, Raviv Monahan and Ariel Barbosa, our students, undergraduate students at EMU, and there's Trina. Spent 3 days, right, billed as the largest gathering of its kind in the U.S. And it was great. Students and staff came back really energized, really good connections, really good questions and conversations. As one student put it, the conference was potentially the most diverse space that she's ever been in. So it's these kinds of stories, these kinds of experiences at CIE that we're really excited about and even feeling a little ambitious about, looking ahead over the next decade about the possibility and the impact of the work of the center. But this is where we need your help and the help of the supporters and partners of CIE. We would love to send another group, actually, to the summer Interfaith Leadership Institute. It happens in Chicago again. It's an annual event. And so, be remiss if I didn't at least put the ask out there for your support and your partnership in ensuring that another group of EMU students and staff can go to Chicago this coming summer to participate in Interfaith Leadership Institute. Again, it's part of what CIE has been trying to do over the last couple of years in particular, of really enhancing the experience, the learning experience of students, and bring back to the question of what is interfaith, not only enhancing and building the capacity and the competency to understand interfaith, but building and nurturing the sensibility that relating across faith difference, whoever you are and wherever you are in the United States, is a critical capacity and a critical competency for any career or for any vocation. So I would ask you to consider if you feel led to support this work. I'm going to stop there and now move into a time of Q&A. Whether about CIU generally, but in particular, Lindsay's work and the work of the Mennonite Jewish Relations Work Group. And I'll invite Lindsay and Trina to respond to those questions.
Okay, I have Mike here. I will bring it around to you if you have questions or comments you would like to make, particularly about the presentation on the research or others that you might want to include.
You spoke, John Fairfield, you spoke of the difficulty of engaging with synagogues and rabbis about the Palestine-Israel issue. What work has there been? Are you aware of any work that would help us to sort that out, and as to how to both be faithful to our own opinions, vision, and hopes, and at the same time avoid the pitfall of speaking to a community, the Jewish community, that is itself riven over this whole issue of how to sort out anti-Semitism from the lack of support or opposition to policies of the Israeli government. So what resources might there be for that issue?
I can speak only of pastors' responses and experience to that, or at least those that responded to me. Tim and Trina might know a little bit more about resources. I can say that pastors, those who talked about having really deep relationships and who were able to talk about it, said mostly that they came from a place of trust. They'd already built trust, and that they were able to have really candid conversations with rabbis, specifically to talk about where their synagogue stood, where their congregation stood, and also where the church's congregation stood. And to be really honest, that way. I will say I didn't hear of any congregational dialogue. Formal, maybe informally it's happening with especially some of the churches that have Jewish members that come, or Mennonite members that then worship in synagogues as well. So that definitely could be happening informally. But no one responded saying that, our whole church was able to talk about this with this whole synagogue, and we have come to a place of mutual understanding, or we've come to a place, if anything, some people said, we agree to disagree. But in none of the stories was there a great congregational dialogue about that. I don't know if you had any more.
I would only add that the research on interfaith engagement itself shows that both for Christian and Muslim and Christian and Jewish relationships, the defining factor in this trust building is mutual service. So acts of service together, either in the community or service for another community outside of the U.S. even. And for our own Interfaith Peace Camp steering committee, the way that it started, where parents from the mosque, the synagogue, and multiple churches, including in Parkview, sat down, mostly women, some men, sat down and got to know each other over a long period of time. And then they did service projects together. And so Interfaith Peace Camp is really centered on the ways that we learn together and the way we serve together. That does not necessarily answer the question that you posed, but that is one big way of crossing these barriers, these bridges, is doing service together. We also showed a film last year, a film series, I forget what it was called, where it highlighted a rabbi and a pastor, rabbi and a mom in New York City. And they kind of skirted the issue, but they really grew to love each other and brought their own groups of students together, and they did service and they learn about each other's scriptures together. But Israel-Palestine really is kind of the elephant in the room, even throughout very strong relationships. Dorothy G.
You mentioned one group. There are other groups, other such groups, but you mentioned Jewish Voices for Peace. Is that a help or a hindrance? Maybe they were so outspoken that they aren't actually accepted by many synagogues. I don't know, but I'd be interested to hear what your experience or what your instinct is about the assistance that we might gain from engagement with groups like that.
That's a really good question. Pastors that mention Jewish Voices for Peace, a lot of the churches, if that was their really only relationship or only contact, maybe outside of an interfaith organization, they reported that having Jewish Voices for Peace made a lot of rabbis, or the one rabbi in the interfaith organization, uncomfortable. They felt some pushback. Also, those churches tended to not have any other relationship. They tended to not engage in service or have any of the other 7 main relationships that we found. So it could be, at least for churches that came back to us and said that, it could be that it might just be a lack of other relationship that meant that the synagogues were uncomfortable, that they didn't know this church and didn't know what this church thought and felt uncomfortable. There was one pastor that did mention that they were able to have a really good conversation with a rabbi that they were close to and build that trust with about Jewish Voices for Peace, and then they came to an understanding about it and realized that really they thought the same things but were uncomfortable with the organization and didn't know what that was going to mean for the church. So in general, from pastors that mentioned Jewish Voices for Peace, it did seem to cause some friction with local synagogues, but also in general, those churches didn't have strong relationships with local synagogues, if that helps.
We have several, go back here and then back across the room. It's good exercise.
I'm wondering how you chose, when you sent out the surveys, how you chose the churches, because, for example, the church I grew up in Ohio, Southern Ohio, I think there are some people there who are very interested in connections with the Jewish people, the Jewish faith, but it's mostly because they think it's important for the end times. And these people are very against EMU's efforts of interfaith, and therefore, and I think we have to be aware, we are aware of that dynamic, but at the same time they cultivate and admire the Jews because they are the chosen people. So, which in a way is kind of an anti-Semitic view too, but they don't see it that way. How do you deal? Why you didn't hit any of those kinds of churches in your survey?
We did. So I actually thank you for asking the question about how we send the emails. I forgot to mention that. I went to MCUSA and they were gracious enough to give me their official list of MCUSA ordained pastors, and then we sent out a mass email to all of them. MCUSA was also very frank that it hadn't been updated in a while, and they were in the process of doing that. So if I missed any churches, I'm sorry if you know of any. So we sent out an email, and we did get a few responses, for example, from a few churches in Ohio, a few churches in Virginia, a few churches in the Midwest, with more mission-oriented, some of them, or a little more what you were talking about too, that reverence without connection. And we did get those. They definitely weren't in the majority, so it didn't come up in our main relationship page and in that number. But We did get a few that were, yeah, I guess outliers, definitely not the majority of our responses. And that's not to say that they're outliers within the Mennonite Church, they're outliers within the 79 responses that I got.
Somebody was pointing over here, I don't know, then I'll come back to one.
Carolyn, Urban Peachy in his book, his memoir, talks about the fact that he felt more comfortable in terms of dealing, say, as a servant work instead of ecumenical prayers. That is, if the prayer was together, it was just a bit more difficult. He felt lack of ease in that case.
So, if I understood correctly, Carol, he felt more comfortable engaging in service where you're actually doing something as opposed to doing a prayer. That included everybody.
And I will echo what Trina said earlier about service being really important. That also showed up in our research as well. So to answer your earlier question, a lot of the churches that had really strong interfaith service were also the ones that had the strongest relationships, or at least felt like they built the most trust.
Ruth Stolzfus Joes. I think one thing that I'm looking for, I mean, perhaps going forward, which is not a role that you necessarily have, and that is the recognition that for the Jewish community now in real time, they are participating in this situation from a place of endangerment. When you think about what they are experiencing right now with anti-Semitism, and not that it's hugely different, but it is different and escalating, that's a hugely different factor than what I'm almost tempted to say, Muslims in this country are facing a lot of difficulties, but the specific escalation of anti-Semitism. So when I think of that, and I think of if we were as Anabaptists in a fraught situation like the 16th century question of whether you're going to be a Munsterite or what you're going to, that's a huge, divisive and complicated internal debate in our community that's really difficult. So I know that this is obvious in some ways, but that's something unique about the situation right now with respect to Christians and Jews. They are in the midst of being under attack in a significant and real way, but I want to, at the same time, I think it's really important to separate out the necessity of our response. It's a moral response that the Jewish community is finding. And they're going in different directions the way any of us are within our communities about what's the moral thing to do. So I think we need to separate what we feel is the right thing to say and do in the situation of what Israel has been and is becoming and doing more of. So I think we have to still be very clear in terms of our moral direction, but to recognize that this partner in the interfaith relationship is undergoing trauma right now, and that is so different, and it's so important to be, and I think people are trying, so maybe I'm just saying something obvious, but I don't see it on the radar in people's thinking, and in a way I'm feeling like we don't intrude on that very fraught question for them, but at the same time, we need to go forward with what we feel is important. I don't know if I'm saying anything worthwhile. Thanks.
Yes. Yes, there is a significant rise in anti-Semitism, and we've seen, or at least a rise in actions based on anti-Semitism. Maybe the sentiment was already there, maybe that's not rising. But definitely people are feeling empowered to act in a way that they didn't. And I think that that's something that a lot of the churches, we talked about those responsive actions, that's what most of the churches are responding to. And that's also one of the reasons that I would really like to see proactive action, because I think it's something that as at least this is what happened in my church. We didn't think about it. We were like, oh, we're not anti-Semitic. There's nothing wrong here. And then something happened in our community that maybe we could have, if we'd been a little more aware, been able to prevent, or at least been able to have a hand in beforehand or in the immediate aftermath, instead of being one of, I'm sure, many churches to reach out after the fact and ask for a dinner, a speaker, something like that. I will also say that you also were talking about the contradictions then about Israel and Palestine and how to do that. And I will say that a lot of churches that mentioned Israel and Palestine as a barrier also wouldn't say that it is stopping their relationship completely. There are a lot of churches that still are managing to really find ways to support the local church community and to have really strong relationships, even if they're not talking specifically about Israel and Palestine. And I think a few pastors specifically mentioned that for a while they thought that that's what they had to talk about, and then realized that that wasn't the only issue.
So I have a couple of responses. One, I would quibble to say that Muslims are not dealing with it. There is research that shows there's maybe 200% increase in religiously motivated violence against both Muslims and Jews. It is on the rise for anyone outside of the Christian faith, and even some within. So this is a widespread, full-on attack on, and I will say it is an attack because using actual violence, vandalism to death in this spectrum. Defacing buildings to cemeteries to attacks on people, and it is rising. And so we as Christians feel like we cannot sit anymore. We cannot be silent. We cannot sit and not actually do something. And so what do? Well, at CIE we have chosen a few paths. We meet with folks from the synagogue on a regular basis. We try to meet with them on a regular basis. I meet with several people from the synagogue on a regular basis because of Interfaith Peace Camp, but there are other ways that we meet with people from the synagogue too. We offer written letters of support, which are read during Friday, during prayer time, during Shabbat time, from CIE, from EMU. We also care deeply about the EMU students that come from Muslim and Jewish backgrounds, and there are multiple undergraduate and graduate at EMU, and so we think a lot about how to support them. It even goes to, do we need to physically protect them? What does that mean? So we have lots of conversations. Tim mentioned that we have a campus innovation grant this year from Interfaith Youth Corps. That has been specifically to listen to EMU students who are outside of the Christian tradition. And at this point, we're not talking about agnostic and atheist. We're talking about Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and Hindu. And that's the population we have been listening to. We want to hear what their experiences are at EMU. We want to hear what their needs are. We want to hear what their experiences of encountering the religious other at a Christian university, what that means for them. We want to take that data at the end of the year and perhaps look into some changes that might need to be made, and also appreciate what we have been able to accomplish. And they're both there. So those are some things that we are able to do. People have been talking about signing different petitions, both on the Iran issue, Christian-Muslim relationships. I mean, it's all just overwhelming, and we have to figure out what's our lens, what's our piece that we can enter into, what can you do. We have found Christians and Jews, or Muslims and Jews have found this solidarity that they have had certainly in the past historically, but really they have nationwide have found a solidarity with each other kind of against Christians. And it is not because they don't like Christians, it's because they need to feel safe in their homes, they need to feel safe in their bakeries, in their churches, synagogues, mosques, wherever they find themselves worshiping at any given time, especially because of space sharing. And so they're finding their own spaces of connection and protection. And it is often protection from us. And that is humbling. So to think about what does that mean for those of us sitting in this room right now? What does that mean for us? And where should we enter in? Keeping in mind the very clear connection fatigue that does happen, and it also happens with folks from the mosque, because there's only one. So anytime there is one space, they can feel overwhelmed. It does not mean that we shouldn't reach out. It just means we need to be aware that there are many of us, there are many Christians, many churches, and in our wish to connect, they might feel fatigued or overwhelmed. And so that's sending letters, sending written letters is always appreciated. Even calling and leaving a voicemail saying, we appreciate you, we see you here, we know that you've been in Harrisonburg for literally decades, decades and decades and decades. We know this, we appreciate your presence. All of these things are options. They're not the thing that's going to end this issue, but it is one step.
Okay, we got a number of hands here, so I'll start with Urban and go across.
Yes, I'm Urban. I want to just build a bit on what Kathy said. There is quite strong support in some congregations throughout Mennonite Church USA for a more Zionist position. As she was saying, supporting perhaps the role of Israel in end times, and there's even congregations that have the Star of David in their church building. So one of the painful realities is that even though we passed this resolution in 2017 about Israel-Palestine, there are probably quite a few pastors who received this survey who didn't answer it because it was from the Center for Interfaith Engagement, which gave a different point of view. So just to say that's part of our reality, strong support for Israel, but perhaps anti-Semitism in the U.S. from the same congregation and the same people. It's just one of the ironies we live with.
Yeah, and I'll also add too that we were specifically talking about connections and relationships, and so we didn't get we didn't hear from churches that don't have a synagogue nearby about their perspectives at all. So this is, specifically about relationships from the 71 churches that responded, but I mean, even of those, of the 25 that responded that they had no relationship, only about 5 or 6 pastors from that group said anything else about it. Some explained it a little bit more, some said, well, here's some of our past, but most of them just said, oh, no relationship, and then kept saying none. Sometimes we're not close, sometimes we don't really feel the need for one. But yeah, there's a lot of perspectives that we don't get.
I'm wondering how many of you know in Harrisonburg, where the Jewish synagogue is. I have 2 friends that are Jews, rather interesting story, I won't go into that. But I've attended a couple of the services at the Jewish synagogue here in Harrisonburg. Do you all know where it is? There are more than, I think there's only one synagogue that I'm familiar with.
Okay, over here, I think, Gerald.
Gerald Cheng, thank you for the work you've been doing. I appreciate that we named the questions of how to deal with complexity in Israel-Palestine as an elephant in the room. I think we've just now named another big elephant in the room, which is the latent cultural anti-Semitism in our society, and the latent, not latent, the active support for Christian Zionism in most of our communities, that those are barriers. We start off with a default of a deficit in relation to Jewish communities. And so we can't simply presume that we come in as neutral or innocent. We have a heritage that is enough Germanic to be default anti-Semite. We have the tsunami of popular Christian nationalism in this country that goes for Christian Zionism. And we have specific instances then of local tensions that come from all of these default settings. So we have to overcome a lot, including our own reluctance to engage with something that can be perceived as threateningly different from our own faith commitments. If you go to Gameo, the official, semi-official websites of our track record in cultural history, you see Jewish evangelism. You go to Virginia Mennonite Missions, there's a history of Jewish evangelism. You go to Mission Network, and we have connections to Messianic Judaism. These are all significant barriers that any serious researcher or curious intellectual partner on the Jewish side would find as really difficult to deal with us. And so I appreciate the work that we're doing, but we cannot proceed as if we just come innocently, cheerfully building friendships and relationships as if there's nothing wrong to start with.
You just perfectly described one of my first interactions with one of my host families in Jerusalem. We sat down, he said, "Oh, what are Mennonites?" And I was like, "Oh, we're Anabaptists." He Googled Anabaptist, and the first thing that came up was, based on the Reformation, and Martin Luther's name came up, and he went, "Oh, Martin Luther, raging anti-Semite." And we were just like, I don't know where to go from here. But yeah, we've definitely come at that. And as you said, we have a history, and we got some responses from current churches whose relationship is, we are very close with a missionary to the Jews, or we are very close with a Messianic Jewish member who has their own mission. And so yeah, there's definitely a reason that a lot of our pastors, a few pastors responded that they're struggling to build trust and don't really know how to proceed.
Well, just to add to the challenges that we're facing, I was actually responding to something that Ruth said a little bit ago about anti-Semitism here, active, violent anti-Semitism. That is a genuine issue that we should all be aware of and doing what we can about. But there is an issue that confuses that whole question, because many out in the airwaves, and certainly from high powers in this country and well beyond, there is a conflation of that kind of anti-Semitism with genuine concerns that are raised by, let us say, Palestinian or Muslim Congress people, such as Rashida Tlaib, and there's a massive conflation of two things going on: the actual violence that's happening here, which is evil, and the intent to raise concerns, genuine concerns about what's happening in Israel. And that's something that I think probably passes 95% of the American populace right by, and they accept that conflation. So that's another challenge that we live with.
Okay, I want to be aware of the time here, so we should be wrapping this up. You have including comments. I didn't see any other hands. Okay.
Well, actually two quick comments I failed to mention earlier, thanking Lindsay for her work, is just, it's a reminder and really underscore this isn't just us doing this work. I think a lot of the observations that have been made and the challenges that have been named are really front and center on the radar of the Mennonite-Jewish Relations Work Group, which is this work group that sort of initiated the research that we were able to offer. In fact, Lindsay's research was highlighted at the Mennonite Church Convention last summer in Kansas City. A number of other folks on that work group were present to facilitate a conversation on this, and there's a bit of interest. In fact, moving ahead in 2020, one of the priorities of that work group is to open up the conversation, host some more virtual, online conversations and webinars even, because of the interest of folks on this issue that reflects some of the sensibility that came out in Lindsay's research, namely, how do we relate across faith difference with our neighbors that don't start from the point of view of how do they fit into my agenda, right, whatever that agenda might be, versus how am I related, how are they a person and a human in my community, that our well-being is wrapped up together. The second quick comment that for us, in engaging this issue at CIE over the last year in particular, we've found ourselves sort of using the framework of understanding white supremacy as a real central piece to what's going on in these conversations, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and so in that regard, one of the things that's done for us is we've been giving energy to racial equity conversations in our community too, that impact across Harrisonburg and Rocky County. So recognizing how faith is racialized in those ways. So thinking about white supremacy as producing and as connected to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. The sensibility there is, avoiding either wars as we do this work. Right? It's either we do this or we do that. Really thinking about relationships.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Lindsay, for your report. I think we'll close at this time. There are brochures over here on the table if you're interested in keeping in contact, and I'm sure CIE would love to have your feedback and questions and comments. You can also visit their office in the seminary building on the first floor of the seminary building there. So help yourself to that.